Isabel, the Straits of Florida, somewhere north of Cuba, 1994, one day from home. Isabel hit the water and sank into the warm Gulf Stream. It was pitch black all around her, and the ocean was alive. Not alive with fish, alive like the ocean was a living creature itself. It churned and roiled and roared with bubbles and foam. It beat at her, pushing her and pulling her like a cat playing with the mouse it was about to eat. Isabel fought her way back to the surface and gasped for air. Isabel, her mother shrieked, her arms stretching out for her. But there was no way her mother could reach her. The boat was already so far away. Isabel panicked. How was it so far away already? We have to get the boat turned, Isabel heard Luis cry. If we don't meet the waves head on, they'll roll us over. Dad, Ivan yelled. Isabel spun in the water, and a wave slammed into her, filling her mouth and nose with salty water and sweeping her under again. The wave passed, and she broke the surface, gagging and choking, but she was already moving toward the place where she had seen Señor Castillo's head before it went under. Her hand struck something in the dark water, and Isabel recoiled until she realized it was Señor Castillo. The sea was tossing him around, but he wasn't moving on his own, wasn't fighting to get back out of the water. Isabel took in as much air as she could and dove beneath the oncoming wave. She found Señor Castillo's body in the dark, wrapped her arms around him, and kicked as hard as she could for the surface. The ocean fought her, sweeping her legs out from under her and spinning her all around. But Isabel kicked until her lungs were about to burst, and at last she exploded up into the cold air, gasping. There! There they are! Ivan cried. Isabel couldn't even try to look for the boat. It was all she could do to keep Señor Castillo's lolling head above the water and catch quick breaths before the waves rolled over them both. But the waves seemed to be smaller now, still deadly, but not as high and fast. Isabel began to feel the rhythm of the sea, the sing-song lullaby of it, and it was easy to close her eyes, to stop kicking, to stop fighting. She was so tired, so very, very tired. And then Ivan was there in the water with them, his arms around her, like they were back in their village, playing together in the waves on the beach. Here, here, they're here, Ivan shouted. Their boat was now alongside her, and her head thumped into the side of it as a wave crashed over her. Hands lifted Señor Castillo from her, and soon they dragged her over the side too. She splashed back down into the half-meter of water that filled the boat, but she was away from the waves, the never-ending waves, and she collapsed into her mother's arms. Rudy! Rudy! Oh, God! Señora Castillo cried, clutching her husband's hand. Señor Castillo was unconscious. Luis and Papi had laid him on one of the benches, and Isabella's grandfather was pumping his stomach like an accordion. Sea water bubbled up out of Señor Castillo's mouth, and he suddenly lurched, coughing and spluttering. Lito and Papi and Luis rolled him over, and he retched up the rest of the ocean he'd swallowed. Rudy! Rudy! Señora Castillo said. She rubbed him in her arms and sobbed, and then everything was quiet and still, but for the gentle lapping of the sea against the side of the boat and the sloshing of water inside it. The tanker had passed. Amara stood at the back of the boat, keeping the rudder straight against the waves, but the engine was dead again. Like everything else, it had been swamped. Señora Castillo reached for Isabel's hand and squeezed it. Thank you, Isabel. Isabel nodded, but it came out more like a shudder. She was freezing cold and soaked from head to toe, but at least she was back in her mother's arms. Mommy hugged her close, and Isabel shivered. We need to get the water out of the bottom of the boat, Papi said. It was strange to Isabel to hear her father talk about something normal, so practical, when Señor Castillo had almost drowned, and the boat had almost rolled over and sunk. But he was right. And get the engine running again, Ivan said. The water first, Lito agreed, and together they gathered up bottles and jugs and began the tedious work of filling them and pouring the seawater back into the ocean. Isabel stayed and buried in her mother's arms, still exhausted, and no one made her get up. "Where's the box with medicine in it?" Luis asked. There weren't too many places it could be in the small boat, and they quickly decided it must have fallen overboard in the confusion. Gone were their aspirin and bandages, and Senor Castillo was still dazed and weak. It was bad, but if they got the boat bailed out, and if they got the engine running, and if they got it back on track with the sun tomorrow, and if they didn't run into any more tankers, they could make it to the States without needing the medicine or matches. If, if. They bailed water out the rest of the night, taking turns dozing in uncomfortable, crowded little boat. Isabel didn't even realize she'd fallen asleep until she jerked awake from the nightmare about a giant monster coming for her out of the dark sea. She cried out, looking this way and that, and there was nothing but blue-black water and gray skies tinged with the red of the sun all around them for miles and miles and miles. She closed her eyes and took deep breaths, trying to calm down. The boat rocked again, and Amada struggled to keep the rudder steady. She had taken over as pilot while Senor Castillo recovered, but they still hadn't gotten the motor running again. The Gulf Stream would carry them north, toward Florida, but they would need the engine to reach the shore. Isabel's mother leaned over to the side of the boat and threw up into the sea. When she slid back down inside, she looked green. The boat was rocking so much now, Isabel couldn't sit on the bench without holding on. The waves were growing higher and higher. "What is it?" Ivan said sleepily. "Another tanker?" "No. Red sky at morning. Sailors take warning," Tito said, looking up into the red-tinged clouds. "A storm is coming." Mahmoud, Izmir, Turkey, 2015, 11 days from home. God help us. That is what we're to ride in? Mahmoud's father said. The boat wasn't a boat. It was a raft. A black, inflatable rubber dinghy with a outboard motor on the back. It looked like there was room for a dozen people in it. 30 refugees waited to get on board. They all looked as tired as Mahmoud felt and wore different colored life jackets. They were mostly young men, but there were other families too. Women with and without hijabs. Other children, some who looked to be about Mahmoud's age. One boy in a Barcelona soccer jersey didn't have a life jacket, but clung instead to a blown-up rubber inner tube. A few of the other refugees had backpacks and plastic bags full of clothes, but most of them, like Mahmoud's family, carried whatever they owned in their pockets. Let's go, one of the smugglers said. 250,000 Syrian pounds or 1,000 euros per person. Children pay full price, including babies, he told Mahmoud's father. There were two more Turks in tracksuits like the ones who had turned them away from the mall, and they stood apart, staring at the refugees like they were something disgusting that had just washed up on the beach. Their scowls made Mahmoud want to disappear again. Dad handed out their life jackets, and they put them on. Mom stared out at the black dinghy bobbing on the gray-black Mediterranean sea water. She grabbed her husband's arm. "What are we doing, Yusuf? Is this the right decision?" "We have to get to Europe," he said. "What choice do we have? God will guide us." Mahmoud watched as his father pushed the cash they'd saved into the hands of one of the smugglers. Then Mahmoud and his family followed his dad onto the dinghy and climbed on board. Walid and his mother sat down at the bottom of the dinghy, his mother holding Hannah tight in her arms. Mahmoud and his father sat on one of the inflated rubber edges, their backs to the sea. Mahmoud was already cold, and the wind off the waves made him shiver. A big bearded man wearing a plaid shirt and a bulky blue life jacket sat down right next to Mahmoud, almost squeezing Mahmoud right off the edge. Mahmoud slid a little closer to his father, but the big man next to him just settled into the extra space. How long will we have to be on the boat? Mahmoud asked his dad. Just a few hours, I think. It was hard to tell on the phone. Mahmoud nodded. The phones and chargers were safely sealed away in plastic bags in his parents' pockets, just in case they got wet. Mahmoud knew because he'd been the one who dug through the trash for the resealable zipper bags. We don't have to get all the way to the Greek mainland, just the Greek island of Lesbos, about 100 kilometers away. Then we're officially in Europe, and we can take a ferry there to Athens. When the smugglers had packed the dinghy full of refugees, they pushed it out to sea. None of the smugglers came with them. If the refugees were going to get to Lesbos, they were going to have to do it themselves. Does anyone know if dinner is served on this cruise? Mahmoud's father asked, and there were a few nervous laughs. The outboard motor roared to life, and the refugees cheered and cried. Dad hugged Mahmoud and then reached down to hug Mom, Walid, and Hannah. They were finally doing it. They were finally leaving Turkey for Europe. Mahmoud looked in wonder. None of this seemed real. He had begun to feel like they were never going to leave. Mahmoud had been so tired he could barely keep his eyes open before, but now the thrum of the motor and the chop of the boat as it hit the wave after wave, flooded him with adrenaline, and he couldn't have slept if he wanted to. The lights of Izmir dwindled to glittering dots behind them, and soon they were out in the dark, rough waters of the Mediterranean. Phone screens glowed in the darkness, passengers checking to see if they could tell where they were. The roar of the engine and the whip blinding sea spray made it impossible to have any kind of conversation, so Mahmoud looked around at the other passengers instead. Most of them kept their heads down and eyes closed, either muttering prayers or trying not to get sick, or both. The dinghy began to toss not just front to back, but side to side in sort of a rolling motion, and Mahmoud felt the bile rise in the back of his throat. On the other side of the dinghy, a man shifted quickly to vomit over the side. "Watch out for the Coast Guard," the big man next to Mahmoud shouted over the noise. "Turks will take us back to Turkey, but the Greeks will take us to Lesbos." Mahmoud didn't know how anybody could see anything in the dark, cloud-covered night, but it helped his seasickness to look outside instead of inside the boat. It didn't help his growing sense of panic, though. He couldn't see land anymore, just stormy gray waves that were getting taller and narrower, like they were driving a boat through spiky tent tops at the Kilis refugee camp. More people leaned over to the side to throw up, and Mahmoud felt his stomach churn. And then the rain began. It was a cold, hard rain that plastered Mahmoud's hair to his head and soaked him down to his socks. The rain began to collect in the bottom of the dinghy, and soon Mahmoud's mother and others were sitting in centimeters of shifting water. Mahmoud's muscles began to ache from shivering and holding the same tight position for so long. He wanted nothing more than to get off this boat. "We should turn back," someone yelled. "No, we can't go back. We can't afford to try again," Mahmoud's father yelled, and a chorus of voices agreed with him. They pushed through driving rain and roiling seas for what felt like an eternity. It might have been 10 hours or 10 minutes. Mahmoud didn't know. All he knew was that he wanted it to end and end now. This was worse than Aleppo, worse than the bombs falling and soldiers shooting and drones buzzing overhead. In Aleppo, at least, he could run, hide. Here, he was at the mercy of nature and an invisible brown speck in an invisible black rubber dinghy in the middle of a great black sea. If it wanted to, the ocean could open its mouth and swallow him, and no one in the whole wide world would even know he was gone. And then, that's exactly what it did. "I see rocks!" someone at the front of the dinghy yelled, and there was a loud boom, like a bomb exploding, and Mahmoud went tumbling into the sea. Joseph, just outside Havana Harbor, 1939, 17 days from home. A strong hand grabbed Joseph by the arm and swung him around. It was a sailor, one of the ship's firemen, and Joseph knew right away he was in trouble. The firemen were big, curlish brutes who were supposed to be on board to put out fires, but lately they'd been walking the decks, harassing the Jewish passengers. They'd been making trouble ever since the Cubans had told them they couldn't leave the ship. For 3 days, the St. Louis had sat at anchor, kilometers from shore. For 3 days, while port officials came and went, Cuban police who had guarded the ladder of the ship told the passengers they couldn't leave today. Mañana, they said. Mañana. Tomorrow, tomorrow. 2 days ago, the SS Orduña, a small English passenger liner, had arrived and anchored nearby. Joseph guessed it was one of the other two ships they'd been racing to Cuba. He and the other passengers had watched the launches went to and from the ship as the yellow quarantine flag went up and then down. And then the Orduña had lifted anchor and cruised into dock at the pier and let off passengers. Why had they been allowed to dock and not the St. Louis? The St. Louis had gotten there first. Captain Schroeder wasn't around to ask, and the officers and stewards had no answers for the passengers. And then today, the same thing had happened with the French ship, the SS Flandre. It arrived, anchored nearby, passed quarantine, docked at the Havana pier, and let off its passengers. Now, it was sailing back to sea. The passengers on the St. Louis had grown more and more restless, cornering soldiers on deck and berating their stewards at dinner. Joseph had felt the tension mounting all over the ship, the pandemonium threatening to boil over every time the crew dealt with passengers. It was as suffocating and oppressive as the 100-degree heat. Apparently, Schneidig and his Nazi friends had felt the tension too, because that's when the firemen patrols had begun. It was nothing official, Joseph was sure, because the captain hadn't made an announcement. It was just certain members of the crew who had taken it upon themselves to police the ship like they were all back in Germany. For the safety of the Jews, Schneidig told them, the same way the Gestapo took Jews into protective custody. Another fireman stood beside the one who held Joseph's arm, blocking out the sun, and between them was Otto Schneidig himself. Just the boy we were looking for, Schneidig said. You are to come with us. Why? What? Joseph asked, looking up at the two men around him. Joseph felt guilty, and he was immediately mad at himself for it. Why should he feel guilty? He hadn't done anything wrong. But then he remembered feeling this way back home too, whenever he passed a Nazi on the street. In Germany, just being Jewish was a crime, and here too, apparently. Your parents' cabin must be searched, Schneidig said. Do you have the key? Joseph nodded, even though he didn't want to. These men were adults, and they were Nazis. One he'd been taught to respect. The other he'd learned to fear. The big fireman had Joseph's arm and he pulled him toward the elevator. Joseph couldn't believe he'd let himself be caught. He'd warned his little sister Ruthie to avoid the firemen, who loved to intimidate the children on board, but she'd managed to stay out of the way. But he'd lost himself watching the Flandre sail out of Havana harbor, his back turned to the promenade, and that's when they'd caught him. Schneidig and his firemen hustled Joseph down the stairs, and Joseph's stomach sank when they ordered him to open the door to his cabin. Joseph's hand shook as he put the key in the lock. He wished there was some way he could get out of this, the way he could keep this man away from his mother and father. Otto Schneidig reached down and turned the handle, throwing the door open. Papa lay on a bed in his underclothes, trying to stay cool in the stifling heat. Mama sat in the chair nearby, reading a book. Ruthie, Joseph was glad to see, was still up at the pool. When she saw the men, Rachel Landau stood on the bed. Joseph's father propped himself up, a look of panic on his face. What's going on here? Mama asked. Joseph? They made me bring them here, Joseph said, his eyes wide, trying to warn her of danger. Yes, Schneidig said, spotting Joseph's father. There he is. Schneidig and two firemen stepped inside. Schneidig closed the door and locked it behind him. For your safety, this cabin must be searched. Schneidig said. On whose authority, Mom asked. Does the captain know about this? On my authority, Schneidig told her. The captain has other things to worry about. Schneidig nodded, and the two firemen ransacked the room. They swept Mamma's makeup and perfume off the vanity and smashed the mirror. They knocked the lamps off the bedside tables and cracked the wash bin. They opened up the family suitcases, which were carefully packed and ready to go to Cuba, and they threw their clothes all over the cabin. They tore the head off of Ruthie's stuffed animal. They snatched the book from Mamma's hands and ripped out the pages, tossing them in the air like ashes from a bonfire. Joseph's mother cried out, but not so loudly that anyone would hear. Papa wrapped himself in a ball and threw his hands over his head, whimpering. Joseph huddled against the door, angry at his helplessness, but scared that if he fought back he'd only be punished more. When there was nothing left to smash or scatter, the fireman stood behind Schneidig at the door. Schneidig spat on the floor. That's what I think of you and your race, he said, and suddenly Joseph understood. This was payback for his father's words to Schneidig at the funeral. Schneidig snorted dismissively at the cowardly man on the bed. It's time you had your head shaved again, he told Joseph's father. Otto Schneidig let himself and the two firemen out, leaving the door wide open. Joseph's mother slid to the floor, crying, and Papa blubbered on the bed. Joseph shook as he buried his face in his hands, trying to hide his own tears. He wanted nothing more than to run into his mother's arms, but she felt millions of miles away from him. So did his father. They were three lonely islands separated by an ocean of misery. Of all things Schneidig and his firemen had broken, the landau was the one thing Joseph wasn't sure they could put back together. You said if I was quiet, if I stood very still, they wouldn't come for me, Papa said. It took Joseph a moment to realize his father was talking to him. Joseph's breath caught. His father was talking about the medical inspection. When Joseph had scared his father to get him to straighten up. Papa looked at him, his eyes red from crying. You said they wouldn't come for me. You said they wouldn't send me back. You promised, and they came for me anyway. Joseph felt like his father had slapped him, even though Papa hadn't touched him. Joseph reeled. He backed into his mother's makeup table, and one of the bottles Schneidig hadn't smashed rolled off and shattered on the floor beside him. Joseph didn't even jump. He had lied to his father, betrayed him, made him think that he was back at that awful place, terrified him all over again. But that wasn't one of the worst things he'd done. Joseph had made his father a promise he couldn't keep. Isabel, somewhere on the Straits of Florida, 1994, 2 days from home. Rain lashed as she shoveled water out of the boat. Scoop, pitch. The bottom of the boat filled as fast as they could bail it out. Isabel and her father, Luis, Ivan, Señora Castillo, they all worked feverishly, none of them talking. Not that they could hear each other over the storm. The only ones not bailing were Señor Castillo, who looked like a ghost, and Amara, who clung to the rudder with white-knuckled hands and tried to keep the boat turned into the churning water so it wouldn't capsize. The engine hadn't worked since their escape from the tanker. The storm clouds turned the day into night, and the driving rain soaked Isabel to the bone. She shivered in the cold wind, her feet numb in the water slushing at the bottom of the boat. Sea spray stung her eyes, and in between scoops of water, she dragged her arm across her face, trying to wipe away the saltwater tears. As she watched the surging waves, Isabel remembered the last time she had seen her abuelita, her grandma. She remembered Lita's hands reaching out for her as the tide swept her away. Isabel had been 9 years old. Her parents had sent her to stay with Lito and Lita in their little shack on the coast. They hadn't said why, but Isabel was old enough to know that her parents had been fighting again, and they wanted to be alone while they worked things out. All that spring, Isabel had waited without joy in the ocean, waiting for the storm to come that would tear her family apart. And then the real storm had come. It wasn't a hurricane, it was bigger than a hurricane, a giant cyclone that stretched from Canada down through the United States and across Cuba and into Central America. Later they would call it the storm of the century, but to Isabel, it was the storm. The shrieking wind ripped roofs off houses and pulled palm trees straight out of the ground. The rain fell sideways, hail shattered windows like never-ending shotgun blast, and the ocean rose up like a giant hand and reached inland over Lito and Lita's little house by the sea, smothering the house in its giant paw and dragging the shattered pieces back into its lair. Lito and Lita hadn't known the storm was coming, or they would have been there. They would have been inland, found higher ground. Castro had promised he would protect them, but he didn't. Not then. Not Isabel's grandmother. Lito had been able to hold on to Isabel, but Lita had been swept away. She had slipped under the waves, her arms reaching for Lito and for Isabel. And that was the last day that had ever seen her. Lito's arms found Isabel again now, wrapped her in a hug. "I know what you're thinking," he said, close to her ear, where she could hear him. "I'm thinking about it too." "I miss her," Isabel told her grandfather. "I miss her too," Lito said. "Every day." Real tears came into Isabel's eyes now, and Lito hugged her tighter. "That was her song's end," Lito whispered, "but ours plays on. Come, keep bailing, or soon it'll be up to our eyeballs." Isabel nodded and went back to scooping water. What if her life was a song? No, not a song. A life was a symphony, with different movements and complicated musical forms. A song was something shorter, a small piece of life. This journey was a song, Isabel realized, a son cubano, and each part was a verse. The first verse had been the riot, the blast of trumpets, the rat-tat of a snare drum, then the pre-chorus of her trading trumpet for gasoline, the piano that gave the son its rhythm, and then the chorus itself leaving home. They were still leaving home and hadn't gotten to where they were going. They would return to the chorus again and again before they were done. But what was the refrain? And how many more verses would there be before they got to the climax of the song, that brash moment at the end of the son cubano that echoed the refrain, and then the coda, those brief few notes that tied it all together? She couldn't think about that now. All she could do was scoop water and pray they didn't drown in the mad conga solo that drummed against the side of their tiny metal boat.